Okay, good morning everyone, in person and indeed online as well. I'm just going to bring you through some of the work that sort of started to feed into the other work packages within Ecostructure. And I suppose, like Taz has said, in terms of mapping and characterising artificial structures within the Irish Sea, both on the Welsh side and on the Irish side as well. Of course, it wasn't just a few people from University College Dublin that were involved in this. There was a wide array of individuals from all the universities that contributed to producing this work as well. What's great about this is I don't have to give much of an introduction. Louise has given a great introduction and background to artificial structures, but just to say in general, ecological communities on artificial structures differ from those on natural hard substrata. And indeed, that's what we're here for, and indeed, that's what we're here for at the back end of this. Trying to come up with methods of improving. In terms of a little bit of background, there is some evidence that communities on artificial structures depend on the environmental context of that artificial structure, its intrinsic properties, and indeed the interactions between those two variables as well. And as Taz has suggested, and indeed Louise as part of her talk, a more detailed understanding of those artificial structures across those variables will better aid the design of future structures going forward. And Louise gave some really nice examples of them. Our research objectives within Work Package 2 were to map and to characterise those artificial structures, to characterise variation and impacts of those artificial structures in different environmental contexts, and as Taz has suggested, at the back end of that, to develop tools to support decision making in terms of the design of those artificial structures going forward, and what the Ecostructure project as a whole can do to aid that and push that knowledge base forward and build upon that evidence base. So in terms of the principal outputs and those tools that session in the afternoon will contain, in terms of, I'll give an overview of the GIS maps and images of coastal structures, the databases that we've gathered from within Work Package 2. Peter won't be here, but Peter was driving the BioPredict tool, and Taz gets the job of stepping up this afternoon to describe BioPredict tool. And then, of course, Tom will also talk about the tool as well. But pulling it back to the GIS maps and just give you a brief overview of what we'll cover this afternoon and what we've done within the Work Package 2 element. This work was done by Brian Thompson, our PhD student, or our former PhD student. He graduated last Friday as well. But Brian did a mammoth amount of work to map and to characterise all of the artificial structures along the coastline of Ireland and Wales. He did that remotely by staring down a computer screen for a very long time, looking at Google Earth, evaluating from Louth up towards Northern Ireland, all the way down as far as Cork, and he mapped all of the structures along the Irish coastline and indeed across the whole Welsh coastline. He didn't just get the coordinates, he also measured the abundance and lengths of all those structures, recorded the coordinates, evaluated some of those intrinsic and extrinsic characteristics of the structures, things like salinity, things like the slope, the aspect of those structures, and then also evaluated the proportion of coastline that was replaced by those. So how much of a loss of those natural shores occurred along our coastline. In total, Brian spent a very long time and he evaluated 6 6,887 structures along the coastlines. Ireland won out. It's like the Six Nations, but sort of less of a prize. We had slightly more artificial structures than Wales, but that's not necessarily a winning thing. In terms of those maps, that database is really a nice database to be able to create GIS maps to evaluate where the highest densities of those structures occur at various areas along our coastline. That database and those maps are available on our repository, and this tool, if you like, that stakeholders and those involved in coastal systems can access that database on our Zenodo repository, and I'll talk a little bit more detail about that forward. So that's the mapping sort of spoken about. In terms of the characterization within a subset of all of those artificial structures across both Ireland and Wales, we evaluated the biota associated with those structures at both site and quadrat level. We sampled the biota, and we also sampled the physical characteristics of those. And we sampled those at a quadrat level and evaluated the associated topography with that biota at a quadrat level. And also did some physical modelling of the structures themselves and associated natural shorelines as well, using terrestrial LiDAR scanning and also drone models as well. So we were able to create physical 3D models of all those structures that we selected for the sampling. So in total, there was about 54 sites with a 50-50 split between artificial and shorelines as well. What this allowed us to do was to understand the relationship between topography and the biota on both natural shores and artificial shores, and indeed to come up with the best topography to use. So Louise spoke about artificial structures being retrofitted with nooks and crannies for species. And a lot of that work has involved a sort of graphic designer's interpretation of what topography could be. What we've done within work package 2 of Ecostructure is sort of evaluate what nature does best. So the natural topography that's associated with those shorelines, scored them in terms of species richness, in terms of a number of different indices, and come up with the best natural topographies that will support more biota on artificial structures. So you can read about that in a little bit more detail in Ali's paper in ecological engineering. No worries. So in terms of that work and that big data set that we've created as part of phase 2 of Ecostructure, and in terms of scaling up that idea of natural topography, we revisited that data set in the phase 2 of the project, went back to that data set, evaluated topography once again, its relationship with the biota, and then we're scaling up those ideas and working with Cubex and JP Concrete to come up with sort of bigger versions. Like Louisa said, where do we go from now? How do we scale this up? How do we have a sort of larger impact and a larger benefit to biota as a whole? And we've developed habitat units and wall panels with natural topography that will be applied at sites over in Dublin hopefully in the next couple of months, and we can scale up. In terms of the physical models that I spoke about as well, these are also available for use and by stakeholders as well, and these will be housed on a Google Drive folder. It's linked in with that repository, and a quick email to me will allow access to some of those LiDAR models and some of those physical models, drone data, and indeed in time the biotic data that's associated with subset of those. And that's me. Very, very quickly, I've covered quite a huge work package in quite succinct time, but I'm very happy to talk about it in more detail over the course of